Welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. What a week we've had. Another batch of Nigerians evacuated from South Africa returned home on Friday. There were 271 in number, and this was after there were grumblings as to the slow speed of the evacuations. Well, there was a fourth evacuation flight from South Africa on that Friday since the anti-immigration protests turned violent, and many in South Africa called for all foreigners, mainly those undocumented, to return to their home countries. This brings to 864 now the number of Nigerians who have been evacuated from South Africa in light of the recent agitations in the country. There are 3 additional evacuation flights expected this week to bring back home some 700 more Nigerians who had voluntarily registered, been screened and cleared for evacuation. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs appreciates relevant ministries, departments and agencies involved in the exercise and says the evacuation process clearly underscores the priority accorded to the protection of Nigerian citizens overseas. In the meantime, the Nigerian government has strongly condemned the recent killing of 2 Nigerian nationals in South Africa. A statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs says one victim, Emeka Charles Iregbu, was reportedly killed by Shwane Metro police officers on June 28, 2026 in Sunnyside, Pretoria, using gruesome interrogation techniques. On April 20th, 2026, the same officers who killed Emeka were allegedly responsible for the extrajudicial killing of another Nigerian, Nemeka Matthew Andrew Ekpeong. The statement says his case is still pending and no arrests have been made, even though the 4 officers involved were known to the South African Police Service, SAPS for short. The second victim of recent violence is that of Mr. Musa Yunana Joe, popularly known as Big Joe, who was killed in front of his shop on June 28, 2026 in Witbank, Mpumalanga. The ministry knows that the killing was committed by yet-to-be-identified criminals. It says the 2 killings come at a time when foreigners are being unduly targeted in South Africa, and it raises questions about deliberate attempt by some elements to wrongfully generalize and tag well-meaning, hard-working Nigerians as criminals. It says this also raises further questions over the general safety of Nigerians and other foreigners in South Africa. The statement further says Nigeria expresses great concern over the recently televised public statement by the spokesperson to the South African government, asking Nigerians leaving the country due to the xenophobic protests to show where they hide illegal drugs. It says the unguarded public statements are unacceptable and are strongly condemned. Such derogatory, unprofessional and uncensored generalized public statements by highly placed government officials constitute hate speech that influence and incite negative and criminal actions against members of the Nigerian community. That statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs says the gang leaders of groups such as March on March and Operation Dudula, who incite violence and hate against fellow Africans, will also be held to account as a matter of regional and international criminal liability. It calls on the South African authorities to conduct urgent investigations into the 2 killings and several other pending cases of extrajudicial killings of Nigerian nationals in South Africa, and ensure that the perpetrators of the heinous crimes are brought to justice without further delay. Needless to say, hundreds more nationals of different African countries have been leaving South Africa as well. Malawians, Ugandans and Somalis, even Zimbabweans. These groups of people have been leaving in droves. It's certain we will begin to see the impact of the exit soon. And now to another major event this week. The government of Switzerland returned 18 artifacts to Nigeria. The artifacts are packed of the famous Benin bronzes, which were looted from Benin at the end of the 19th century. The artifacts are cast in metal or carved from ivory at the Royal Court of Benin. The handover of the items were done at the National Museum in Lagos, with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments on behalf of the federal government of Nigeria. During the restitution ceremony participated in by Swiss federal councillor Elizabeth Bohm-Schneider and the Minister of Arts, Culture, Tourism and Creative Economy, Hannatu Musawa, who signed an agreement on the transfer of cultural items. The restitution follows several years of collaborative research carried out under the Benin Initiative, Switzerland. I later sat down with the director of the Ethnographic Museum at the University of Zurich, Alice Hedzog, about the repatriations. I have joining me now director of the Ethnographic Museum at the University of Switzerland, Alice Hedzog. She has been in Nigeria for just a while and comes with good tidings. Alice, welcome to Lagos, welcome to Nigeria. You accompanied the entourage, the group of people who came with, the artifacts that are being delivered to Nigeria, certain parts of Nigeria. We'll discuss that later. And I'm wondering, if for the period of time that these artifacts have been in Switzerland, in Zurich, for example, have they been as fascinating to visitors as, anyone who's coming to Europe would be as fascinated by, artifacts in your museums?
That's a good question. Thank you very much, Amalaj, and thank you for welcoming us here today. So these artifacts, and we're talking about the Benin bronzes from Edo State, have been in our museum for around 80 years now. So they've been there for a long time. They were purchased. From the art market, and they have fascinated and enchanted museum publics in Europe, right? The objects of great beauty, great technical skill. When I explain to my visitors, I say, this is 16th century 3D printing, right? Coming from West Africa. And they've been really treasured. But we have realized that they're not ours to keep. Right? And that these objects should never have been in Switzerland in the first place, which is why we're now returning them to Nigeria.
Yeah. And for the period of time that they were or have been in Switzerland, have they been like, academic research, projects for you? What have they taught you about Nigeria? What have they taught you about the Benin people or the people who existed at that time, in space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when they first arrived in Europe, they were above all a source of artistic inquiry, right? They were very inspiring for artists at the beginning of the 20th century who were really taken back by the aesthetics of these objects. But more recently, we've been asking different questions around them. We've been working with people from Benin City, artisans, for example, bronze casters or descendants of the Guild of the Ivory Carvers, to try and understand the histories behind these objects. We've also been researching with the Nigerian diaspora living in Zurich, who have a great understanding of these objects, who have a connection to them, and who are able to decipher them and reveal the stories behind these objects in a way that would be very hard for us to do. Lots of students have been involved. We've had many master theses, bachelor students, PhD students writing about these objects and their significance. But somehow one of the most preoccupying questions for us has been the question of provenance. So this is the question of how did these get here in the first place, right? How did treasures from the Benin Kingdom end up in museums in Switzerland?
I mean, because if you look at Nigeria's history, Switzerland really isn't part of our history.
Yeah.
You didn't colonize Nigeria.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
How did you plunder?
Exactly. Exactly. So these are objects that were looted in 1897 by British troops. So when British troops attacked the Kingdom of Benin, they took with them, it's estimated, over 10,000 artifacts. So this is a huge displacement of cultural heritage. Those artifacts then, many of them went directly back to the UK or to Germany, and then were sold, either went into museums like the British Museum or were sold on the art market. So there was a real frenzy for the Benin bronzes on the art markets. They were sold at auction houses, and then ended up in the hands of art collectors in Switzerland, and were then purchased by the museum. So that's how they ended up in Switzerland. And we worked together, we kind of, among museums in Switzerland, 8 museums in Switzerland, we came together under an initiative called the Benin Initiative Switzerland to investigate the provenance of these objects in our collections. Yeah.
But is it such a bad thing, that some of these artifacts ended up in parts of Europe? Because in a way, they've helped Europeans understand the continent Africa. They've also helped them to understand the people and to realize that, there has been some sort of civilization here before the advent of the British and all the other colonial powers. Yeah,
that's a good point, because fundamentally there's nothing wrong with having foreign cultural heritage in one's museum, right? There's nothing wrong, for example, if the museum here in Nigeria was to show heritage from Spain or from the States or from Japan, right? I think what's problematic is how they were acquired, right? That these aren't objects that were given or sold, they were taken without consent in a really violent moment of appropriation, and that's what we find problematic. Yeah.
So you're returning 18 of those artifacts. Are there more in Switzerland?
Yeah, so our museum at the University of Zurich, we're returning 14, and there are 2 others coming from Museum Riedberg and the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva. So this is a pan-Swiss initiative. There are objects that still remain in Switzerland, and it will be interesting to see how this process now takes new dynamics, right? I think you will have future Swiss visitors coming, yeah.
So this is a first time for Switzerland. This is the pilot. It determines, how other repatriations will take place.
Yeah, so other museums have had experiences in the past. For example, the museum in Geneva has repatriated objects previously, but this is the first time that we have done this together. Right? And it's really significant for us. It's really significant for the museums, for the visitors, for the students back home, but also for the Swiss government, because we saw yesterday that we had a federal councillor travelling with us, the Councillor Baumschneider, who was with us to sign a new agreement with Nigeria. And so we see that this is not just a question that concerns museums or curators or professionals in the kind of heritage sector, but it's more of a societal question, right? Of how are we dealing with the past, right?
So be honest, Alice. Are you sad to see them go?
I have shed quite a few tears over the last weeks, I must say, as they were being packed up in my museum so carefully, right? We had these like custom-made boxes made for them, and they were little padded cushions to make sure that they were.
Got to see those
you got to see those yesterday, and I have to say it was a moment. It's a bit like when someone dear to you leaves, and you know that it's good for them, and you want to wish them farewell, and at the same time you know that you will miss them. But then seeing them land here, right, and seeing the kind of the dignity and the excitement with which they've been welcomed back home, that makes it all good.
Yeah, it makes it all worth it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, if you ever wonder if Africans appreciate these artifacts. The museum culture is still growing here in Nigeria. You don't have a lot of people going to museums, going to see our history, going to see things from relics from the past that, just tell more about our people and, where we're from and what we did back in the time. And people also wonder if these artifacts came from Benin, they think it's all going to the Oba's palace, right? And nobody really would get a chance to see them except foreigners like yourself, if you did visit the Oba's palace, or probably VIPs, but ordinary Nigerians really won't get the chance to see them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are kind of 2 questions there, right? The first is, do museum objects matter for everyday Nigerians? And I was in the National Museum yesterday, here in Lagos, waiting for the ceremony to happen, and a group of school kids came in, right? And there was this fantastic museum curator who was taking them round the exhibition. So new exhibition, it's a great exhibition, very well curated. And there was a way in which she embodied the stories that were told behind those objects and the way in which the children were responding. And it was such a form of storytelling, right? Using artifacts not just as museum relics, but using artifacts and objects as a way of transmitting
Oral history.
And I think that this is something we can all agree on that Nigerians excel in.
There's more of my conversation with Professor Hedzog after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Let's head on now to the concluding part of my interview with Professor Alice Hedzog on the repatriation of those Benin artifacts to Nigeria.
You know, I have often wondered, you know, when you're returning artifacts, have you ever, you know, been faced with a problem where the countries you were returning them to probably couldn't preserve them as well as you did, and they returned them to you and said, hold this for us for, you know, the future?
Yeah, we have a few of those cases. Yeah, we have a few examples of, for example, a minority group, an indigenous minority group in a country that doesn't feel safe under the current government, right? And has said, don't return these objects now. We'd rather you kept them for us. We also have indigenous group we're working with who says it's good you hold on to these objects for us for the moment, but for that there needs to be trust, right? There needs to be trust that the day that they would like access, that they would have that access, and that's something that we work hard on, trying to build up relationships with the groups that these objects come from.
With the signing of the agreement between Nigeria and Switzerland, but there was something the principal officer from Switzerland said, that this was not a government-to-government conversation at first. This was, you know, by the locals first of all, came from the grassroots, and then it built up to political level. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is very Swiss. So we're a very bottom-up culture in Switzerland, where decisions happen quite often on the ground. And so this started really with the museums. This started with the Museum Riedberg in Zurich, that said, wait a sec, we should know what we have in our Benin collections, and let's check to see if any of these are looted objects. So they reached out to the other museums in Switzerland. We got some support from the Federal Office of Culture, and we started to investigate those collections. So I was doing the research along with a Nigerian scholar, Enibukun Ozebo, from the University of Benin City. She's a historian, and together the two of us did this kind of detective work, right? Trying to figure out how did the objects arrive, what was their significance. Oh, it took a few years. And we still have some open questions. But what we were able to establish is that almost half of the objects had been looted or probably looted, right? And then we brought everyone involved together in one room. And over the course of a kind of heated afternoon, we discussed, okay, what do we do now? And by everyone, I mean people from the Nigerian government, from the National Commission of Museum and Monuments, all of the museum directors, museum staff, the artisans, the bronze casters, and we agreed, okay, these objects, we should be ready to do a transfer of ownership. And only then did we then go up to our respective bodies and governing institutions and make a case for this. And we've been very supported. For example, the University of Zurich took this brave decision to restitute these objects, the same with the city of Zurich or the city of Geneva. And more recently, and this was the last step that we saw yesterday, the federal government of Switzerland building on this trust and these relationships that had been established over the course of this project, thought, okay, let's take this further, and together with the Minister of Culture here in Nigeria, signed this agreement, which is on the prevention of illicit trafficking.
So the agreement helped to speed up the process. Did it also provide, because it provided a clear understanding, about where the artifacts would be returned to and to whom? While you were doing research as to where these artifacts came from, as the realization dawned on you and your fellow researcher, did you both take a minute perhaps to appreciate what exactly you were doing and how this will further impact future generations?
Yeah. I mean, there were many such moments, I have to say. There were many such moments, and often they were accompanied by visitors from Nigeria entering into our depot and seeing in their hands the proof that this violent looting happened, right? At times, people would break into prayer, into song. At times, people were just very quiet. And what we sensed there was often a mix of emotions. The joy of rediscovering these treasures, and then the grief, right? The grief of why they were here, right? And I think we've held those two things moving forward, right? Yeah. And then moments like yesterday when the curators in the museum here in Lagos were unpacking the objects, one held one of these plaques up with such pride, right? And I thought, okay, they're back in the right hands now.
I imagine the emotion in the room, realizing that they're part of history. And somehow, Alice, you have become part of Nigeria's history because you have helped to discover artifacts outside of Nigeria. You helped to identify them. You've also helped to trace the original ownership of these artifacts and helped to return them, to the places that they belong to and the people that they belong to. So thank you for bringing them, to Lagos and to Nigeria. Some might be asking, though, what impacts what you have done, would have on this present generation, culturally, politically, spiritually, perhaps. Do you ever think about that?
I do. I'm aware of the impact it will have back home in Swiss museums, and I think it does have potential here in Nigeria as well. During my research, I met a fabulous gentleman, Patrick Oronsaye from the Kingdom of Benin, and he explained to me, he said, Alice, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you're coming from, right? And these Benin bronzes, they tell the history of Benin City, right? They tell the history of a strong pre-colonial empire. And I would hope that contributes to, empowering people who come into contact with those objects. What we're seeing as well is that it's having an impact on all kinds of creatives and artistic projects here in Nigeria. For example, there is a collective of young poets who have written poems to welcome the objects home. We've seen the bronze casters be really kind of empowered by these processes as well. We're working very closely with Phil Omodawen, who is a 6th generation bronze caster.
I met him yesterday.
He's quite a figure, and he is now casting a plaque for us to take home, showing the patron saints of Zurich, our city. And so what we see here is that there are new relationships opening up, new forms of cultural exchange between Nigeria and Switzerland. And we look forward to seeing what comes out of this. Yeah.
So I know you have only a few hours left in Nigeria. Is it bittersweet for you going back to Switzerland?
It is. But we have some ideas of how we could continue to work with the National Commission for Museum and Monuments, with the staff in the museum. So I hope that we'll be back soon.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Alice.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you for bringing us, this really good news. It's part of our history, our culture, for helping us to realize, for some of us who didn't know that we're missing, for some who now know that they were missing and have been returned, and for those who, have a personal connection with these artifacts. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this is where we end the program today. If you're a Nigerian still in South Africa, do stay safe as much as you can. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.